A ceasefire had already been announced when rescuers in Beirut were lifting an older woman out of a building ripped in half. That is how this story really begins, not with diplomats shaking hands, but with the first proof that the word truce was already failing the people who were supposed to be protected by it. Hours after the ceasefire announcement, Israeli strikes hit busy commercial and residential areas in central Beirut without warning. So before anyone could sell this as a technical disagreement over wording, the region had already watched one side to keep writing the story in fire. And the detail that destroys every polite explanation is the homework left unfinished in the rubble. When family photos, clothes, and school papers are being pulled out of wreckage after a ceasefire has supposedly begun, nobody hears fine print anymore. They hear betrayal. If you watch this channel, you already know the rule. When allies start sounding like prosecutors, the real story is bigger than the strike itself. Subscribe now and tell me below in one word what this looked like to you. Breach, loophole, or scam. This was not some remote border exchange that could be buried under military language. Several dense commercial and residential parts of central Beirut were hit without warning, which meant every capital watching this had to decide fast whether it was still looking at a managed war or at the public humiliation of a ceasefire. That is the click this title promised, and that is the real answer. Europe did not turn because Europeans suddenly discovered war is ugly. Europe turned because Italy and Spain looked at this sequence and saw the same thing millions of viewers saw instantly. If a truce is announced and Lebanon is blasted anyway, then the truce is either being broken in substance or exposed as a lie in design. That is why the story is dangerous. Not because the language around it is emotional, but because the sequence is lethal to the official narrative. A ceasefire is supposed to lower pressure. This one announced calm to the world, while one of the region's most explosive fronts was still erupting in real time. Then came Israel's defense, and this is the line everything hangs on. Lebanon was not part of the deal. That sentence is supposed to clean up the whole mess. Instead, it made the whole mess much bigger. Benjamin Netanyahu's office said Israel supported the 2-week pause on Iran, but the ceasefire did not include Lebanon. In one move, Israel tried to keep the diplomatic credit of de-escalation with Tehran while preserving the freedom to keep hammering Hezbollah in Lebanon anyway. That line may work in a briefing room. It does not work in the gut, because once the public sees smoke over Beirut after hearing the word ceasefire, the mind does not say, maybe this is a legally consistent carve-out. The mind says the pause is fake where it matters most. And that is exactly where Italy and Spain became central. They were not the decoration in the headline. They were the proof that parts of Europe were no longer willing to treat Lebanon as the acceptable whole inside a parcel. For cold regional truce, Italy moved first in the language of responsibility, and that matters. Rome did not frame this as mild concern or regrettable timing. It framed the Lebanon front as inseparable from whether the ceasefire had any serious value at all. Italy's government said the ceasefire had to be seized as an opportunity to bring an end to the war in Lebanon too. That is not a side comment. That is an allied government rejecting the idea that Lebanon could be left burning while the same ceasefire was being marketed as a step toward regional stabilization. That is why this title says Europe turns on Israel, not Europe complains about Israel. Complaint is routine. This was different. Italy was effectively saying that if Lebanon stays outside the pause, then the pause itself starts losing meaning. And Spain was even more important for the title's punch, because Spain pushed the logic further. The Spanish posture was not simply, this is terrible, please stop. It was closer to, this is exactly how a truce gets gutted, while everyone pretends it is still standing. That is a completely different register. It is the difference between humanitarian discomfort and strategic accusation. Spain and Italy demanded explanations after Israeli soldiers detained a Spanish United Nations peacekeeper and fired warning shots at an Italian convoy. In other words, the war was no longer just touching Lebanese civilians and diplomatic formulas. It was touching European personnel under a UN mandate. That changes everything. A government can absorb images of destruction and still hide behind diplomatic balance. It gets much harder to stay calm when your own peacekeeper is detained and your own convoy is taking warning shots, while the same battlefield is being defended as somehow outside the truce. That is when allies stop sounding like allies. They start sounding like states that think the rules are being ignored in front of them. And once that tone appears, the title's promise is no longer hype. It is description. Because now Italy and Spain are not just reacting to Israel's violence. They are reacting to Israel, acting as if even Europe's stakes in Lebanon, its soldiers, its UN role, its ceasefire framework, its diplomatic credibility can simply be pushed aside. Udafil said any detention of a United Nations peacekeeper is a blatant violation of international law. That phrase matters because it turns what could have been dismissed as one ugly incident into something much more dangerous. A signal that the war is now colliding with the protected status of peacekeepers operating under Resolution 1701. That is why the phrase truce breach lands even when politicians use more careful words. A breach is not only about one signed clause. It is about the destruction of the conditions that make a ceasefire believable. And when UN-linked movements are obstructed, while Beirut is being hit hours after a ceasefire announcement, those conditions are being destroyed in front of the world DUM. So no, the deeper issue here was never just whether some mediator used sloppy wording. The deeper issue was whether Israel was allowed to keep one theater active so aggressively that the truce regional, the credibility collapsed anyway. Italy and Spain answered that question with their behavior. They clearly thought the answer was no. Spain's role becomes even sharper when you look at how it framed the legal and political landscape. Madrid was not improvising outrage. It was placing the Lebanon offensive inside an older ceasefire structure that Europe says was already supposed to govern the field. A ministerial line carried through Spain's foreign ministry said all parties must abide by the November 2024 ceasefire agreement and fully implement Resolution 1701. That is Europe saying, this is not just about a new US-Iran pause at all. It is about Israel continuing military action in a space where ceasefire obligations were already supposed to exist. That is the hard layer under the title. If Spain is already treating the battlefield through the lens of an existing Lebanon ceasefire framework, then the April strikes do not look like an unfortunate misunderstanding. They look much closer to truce-breaking behavior by effect, by sequencing, and by political consequence. That is exactly what the audience came here to hear, and it is exactly what a softer script would hide. The real charge is not that Europe disliked the optics. The real charge is that key European actors were beginning to treat Israel as the state blowing a hole through de-escalation. And once that charge appears, the burden of proof shifts. Israel is no longer just explaining what it hit. It is now explaining why any ally should believe in the truce after watching Lebanon burn through it. This is also why the human footage mattered so much, not only because it was horrifying, but because it made legal ambiguity emotionally impossible to sustain. Once people see civilians trying to decode whether they can go home while bombs are still falling, they stop hearing official nuance as nuance. They hear it as cover. Bokatua called the scale of the killing and destruction in Lebanon nothing short of horrific. That matters because it means the condemnation was not coming only from political rivals or angry publics, but from a rights framework openly saying the violence had reached a level that was crushing the legitimacy of the moment itself. And timing made that judgment even harsher. The carnage came within hours of a ceasefire with Iran. That means the world did not process this as just another terrible day in a terrible war. It processed it as the immediate contradiction of the truce. That contradiction is what pushed Europe over the line. Because Europe can live with uncomfortable alliances. Europe can live with ugly military logic. What Europe struggles to live with is being told a regional de-escalation is underway while one of the linked fronts is exploding in a way that makes de-escalation look dishonest. This is where the story stops being about casualties alone and becomes a story about control. Who controls the meaning of the ceasefire? Who controls whether Lebanon counts? And who controls whether Israel acts like the same regional logic applies to it? Europe's foreign policy machinery and aligned governments explicitly called on Israel to avoid any further widening of the conflict, including through a ground operation on Lebanese territory. That is Europe signaling that the danger is not only what Israel has already done, but what Europe thinks Israel may still be prepared to do next. And once your allies start thinking that way, you have a much bigger problem than criticism. You have allies beginning to see your campaign not as a painful contribution to stability, but as a source of instability in itself. That is the psychological break buried inside this title. Notice something else here. Europe was not exonerating Hezbollah. Europe was still condemning Hezbollah, backing Lebanese state control and supporting Resolution 1701, which means this was not sloppy moral panic. It was a targeted conclusion that even with Hezbollah blamed, Israel's conduct was still pushing beyond what allies were willing to tolerate. That makes the backlash much harder for Israel to dismiss. This is not coming from people pretending Hezbollah did nothing. It was coming from actors saying Hezbollah is a problem, and Israel's current conduct is still blowing up. The truce logic. Anyway, now we get to the most dangerous layer of all. Because once Italy and Spain start talking this way, the story stops being a fight over what happened in Beirut yesterday. It becomes a fight over whether Washington can even manage its own side of the board. If the White House says a regional pause is in place, but Israel simultaneously behaves as if Lebanon remains fully open ground, then every other player starts learning the same lesson. The US may announce the deal, but it does not fully control the battlefield logic of the ally most capable of wrecking it. One of the clearest strategic readings cut right through the noise. Israel's insistence that Lebanon was outside the agreement revealed a key vulnerability and showed the limits of the United States to manage its allies. Strip away the formal language, and the meaning is brutal. The ceasefire exposed a command problem inside the very camp, claiming it had stabilized the region. That is why this video is not just about Europe being angry. It is about Europe seeing a weakness it cannot unsee. If Washington cannot align Israel with the political meaning of the pause it just announced, then every future pause becomes suspect the moment it is unveiled. Tehran sees that, Hezbollah sees that, Lebanon sees that, and Europe sees it too, which is why the tone shifts from concern to something colder and more accusatory. Concern says, please do not escalate. This new tone says, you may already be the escalation. That is the point where viewers either stay with the story or miss the whole thing. The real fracture is not moral first, it is strategic first. Europe is beginning to talk like restraining. Israel is now part of regional stabilization, not a betrayal of it. And there is still one layer below even that. Europe is not reacting only to a day of strikes. Europe is reacting to where this campaign could be heading in southern Lebanon, and to the possibility that the operational reality is much larger than the official justification. Field analysis was already warning that Israel may retain a limited presence in southern Lebanon for the foreseeable future. That means Europe was not only looking at one brutal day of attacks, but at the possibility that the campaign was hardening into a longer military footprint, with consequences that outlive the ceasefire headlines. And once that possibility is in the frame, the line that Lebanon was not part of the deal becomes even more explosive, because a front that may involve enduring presence, territorial pressure, and prolonged displacement is not a side skirmish, politely running next to diplomacy. It is one of the places where diplomacy lives or dies. That is why the audience's instinct was right to click this title. They were not just looking for another update from a war zone. They were looking for the moment allies stopped pretending this was business as usual. And that is exactly what this sequence gives you. Italy says the ceasefire has to end the Lebanon war too. Spain frames the conflict inside ceasefire obligations. Europe says must be obeyed. A Spanish peacekeeper is detained. An Italian convoy is fired on. Beirut is hit without warning after the truce announcement. Then Europe hardens. That is not random outrage. That is allied trust collapsing in public. And once trust starts collapsing, everything gets harder. Harder to sell diplomacy, harder to sustain UN missions, harder to persuade civilians to believe in the next ceasefire, harder for Washington to claim command. Harder for Israel to say its actions are still serving a larger stabilizing purpose. So let's answer the title with zero softness. If Lebanon truly was part of the ceasefire, then Italy and Spain were reacting to what looked and felt like a truce breach carried out in plain sight. If Lebanon was never formally part of the ceasefire, then Italy and Spain were reacting to something almost as bad, a so-called ceasefire built with a deliberate hole inside it, a hole wide enough for Beirut to keep burning while the world was told the region was cooling down. Either way, the viewer lands in the same place. The strikes on Lebanon were treated by parts of Europe not as routine collateral to diplomacy, but as the act that shredded diplomacy's credibility. That is the title's real payoff. Europe turns on Israel because Europe is no longer only counting the dead or condemning the smoke. Europe is now starting to judge Israel as a force that may be wrecking the very truce architecture Europe needs in order to prevent a much wider collapse. And once allies begin to think that way, the story is already bigger than the bombs. Because bombs can stop. What lasts longer is the conclusion allies draw from them. They will forget the legal footnotes. They will remember the sequence. Ceasefire announced. Beirut hit. Italy and Spain recoil. Europe starts speaking like Israel did. Not just test the truce, it gutted it. Stay with this channel, because we do not stop where the official statement ends. We stay with the story until the power behind the wording becomes impossible to hide.